So in this video, I want to share exactly what I did in order to reverse my type 2 diabetes and exactly the reasons why it works. So there's this metaphor for how blood sugar regulation works in your body that I've always really liked, which is, it's the metaphor of the clogged drain. So imagine you've got a bathtub that's filling up with water, but the drain is clogged. So the water can't go to where it needs to go. And so it keeps overflowing, spilling out into the rest of your house, causing damage and all sorts of issues, right? Now, a lot of people would say, oh, turn off the water. Of course, that's maybe even step one. But does that actually fix the problem? No. And it's actually the same with blood sugar. Let me explain. So when we're talking about type 2 diabetes specifically, we are talking about insulin resistance. So when we think about insulin and what it does in your body, it actually takes glucose, so sugar. So excess glucose in your bloodstream, and it takes that and it deposits it into the tissues, the organs, and it stores that as glycogen to be burned off as energy. That's all a good thing. Like, that is what you want to happen. And so there's a couple trains of thought. Like, number one, you can either stop eating carbohydrates altogether, which can work. And the reason why it works is it defeats the need to even use insulin in the first place. If you have no carbohydrates coming in, you're really not going to need to use insulin for much at all. All right, so a lot of people do like a keto diet. And they're like, oh, I lost weight. High five on that. My A1C is down. High five on that. But the problem arises because, you see, insulin resistance is actually caused by too much saturated fat in the diet.
Insulin resistance, well, I mean, you know, like I know, insulin resistance is caused by fat. It's not caused by sugar. High blood sugar is a symptom of insulin resistance. It's not the cause. High fat is the cause.
You know, in fact, the way that you induce type 2 diabetes in animals is to feed that animal a high-fat diet. So people who are conducting animal studies, that's exactly how they do that.
Right. So that was another epiphany for me, right? I'm sitting here with, tasked with the objective of trying to make animals insulin resistant so that we can use them as a testing ground. And when I started looking in the literature, I was like, how do I make an animal insulin resistant? Okay, I probably got to give them a high fructose diet or a high sucrose diet. And so I was looking in the literature with that preconceived notion. And then I would read, we induced insulin resistance in laboratory animals by feeding them a diet containing 70% saturated fat for 8 weeks. We induced insulin resistance. We induced type 2 diabetes in laboratory animals, by feeding them a high-fat diet. And I was like, this is unreal. You feed animals a high-fat diet and they develop diabetes? Why is it that when in the public, when you say the word diabetes, the first association people make is sugar?
Right. And so when your diet is pretty much entirely fat, the problem arises because, you're kind of not needing to use insulin, which is, again, great. Your numbers will look good in the short term, but you might be eating your way into a worse state of insulin resistance. So as long as you never eat carbohydrates, you're good. But we know, based on the research that we have, that people that do long-term ketogenic diets, it's not ideal. Like, you can't just live on a keto diet. And so when you ever eat carbohydrates again, you run into problems. And then the second way, which is what I did to reverse my type 2 diabetes, is high carbohydrate, low fat, moderate protein intake. And that actually works really well, because if you decrease the overall amount of fat that you're eating in your diet, you are not clogging the drain. You're allowing the glucose to go from your bloodstream into the tissues and organs. So we've actually known this information for the better part of about 100 years. My favorite study, and I love to quote this one, James W. Anderson at the University of Kentucky. This is back in the 1970s. So he took a bunch of insulin-dependent type 2 diabetics. So these are people that were in bad enough shape to where they needed insulin to survive. Like, let that sink in. Now he takes these people and he puts them on a high carbohydrate, low fat, moderate protein intake diet. So this is based on potatoes, whole grains, legumes, like even whole grain breads and stuff. So a high starch, high carb diet. And within 16 days, the majority of the participants in the study were off their insulin altogether. But the most interesting part about that study to me He practically force feeds these people so that they do not lose a single pound. And the reason why is because he doesn't want to attribute any of the success to just weight loss. And that's by no means the only study that's proven this. I mean, Dr. Walter Kempner, he had the study where he put people on like a diet of white rice, white table sugar, fruit and fruit juice, and saw phenomenal results with like reversing like type 2 diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, like, and that's by no means like a healthy diet. You know, in fact, and this is also real, I have to look up the name of the author of the study, but in the 1970s, there was this guy that put a whole bunch of people on a sugar water diet. Really, like it was like glucose in water and like a tiny bit of protein powder, but the overall calories coming from fat, 0%. The same exact thing. He actually saw improved levels of glucose tolerance after feeding people a diet of nothing but sugar water. That's wild. And by no means do I actually recommend a diet that's nothing but like table sugar and like protein powder. Like that's crazy. But the reason why it works is because it's so incredibly low in overall fat. And so it's unclogging the drain. The sugar is not necessarily the problem. The problem is that your body is intolerant to sugar. It's like the drain is clogged. And now for the record, the diets that I am describing, those are protocol diets. And just like I said in a video like 2 videos ago, it's really important to know that when you're doing a protocol diet that you know that it is not for the rest of your life. At least for most people it won't be. Like the time that you have to take on these diets is different for everyone. My type 2 diabetes was gone within like 3 months for sure. I was like 225. I went all the way down to like 150, 155. And I've sustained 160 to 170 pretty much ever since. So another thing that I think is really important in this discussion is to understand what are carbohydrates, because too many people demonize carbohydrates and the only thing that they think of is, oh, it's just sugar. It's white table sugar. That's like painting with the broadest brush. Like, I know that there's lots of people that say that all carbohydrates are sugar. I just disagree with that. After all, the truth resists simplicity. Like a perfect example of this would be fruit. Like the fructose that's in fruit. A lot of people say, oh, it's just sugar. And then there's some people that say, oh, but it's natural sugar, so it's better, which is kind of true. But like the reason why is because the fructose that's in fruit is actually processed by your liver. Up to 70% of it is processed by your liver as opposed to your pancreas. And if you know, your pancreas is responsible for creating insulin. So inherently, it's gonna have less of an insulin spike that's associated with it. Major difference. And then of course, it also comes in the package of that whole food. So it's basically a delivery mechanism for all that fiber, all the micronutrients. Like, fruit's amazing for you. Don't just lump everything into the category of sugar. And so like what I ate specifically to reverse my type 2 diabetes, it's a diet that's rich in fresh fruits, vegetables, leafy greens, a handful of nuts and seeds is like my fat source, limited amounts of avocados and coconuts. Would do a lot of intact whole grains, potatoes, sweet potatoes, legumes. Like that all helps to regulate blood glucose. But the other part of that is you want to make sure that your overall fat intake's low. So that means like things like animal products, butter, even like the plant-based butter replacements, those are still higher in fat. Oils, I limit my consumption of those foods a lot.